Alright folks, so today I'm here to discuss with you an episode that has been driving me crazy since its release. The Tales of the Walking Dead episode, Amy and Dr. Everett. What makes this episode special is that it allegedly takes place 35 years after Monument Day. If you're enjoying this type of content, be sure to hit that like button and drop a sub if you're feeling generous. If you've seen Tales of the Walking Dead, you may be confused. Where does this 35 years in the future thing come from? Before the release of Tales, showrunner Channing Powell had attended an interview with Collider at Comic-Con, where she stated the following.
No, they take place over, we tentatively 35 years into the future. Don't quote me on that, Scott will kill me, but
So, according to the Tales showrunner, one of the episodes in the first season tentatively takes place up to 35 years into the outbreak. She also asks us not to quote her on that. Yeah. If I'm being honest, this really sounds like it was something Channing Powell was not supposed to say, as it is never stated in another interview or any of the episodes themselves. Channing even sounds apprehensive to say it in the interview.
don't quote me on that, Scott will kill me, but
So, this isn't even meant to be taken as fact, but where did this come from? You don't just pull something like that out of thin air. Well, I mean they might, but where there's smoke, there's fire. So, which episode would she have been talking about here? It's Amy and Dr. Everett. Okay, it might not be that simple, but I'd say it's the safe bet. The first 3 episodes pretty clearly take place between Monument Day and the first couple years of the outbreak, so those are off the table. In an interview with Embeth Davids, I'm so sorry if I butchered that, the actress for Amanda in Tales' 5th episode, she's quoted in saying, "When talking to Lone, who played Nora, I said to her, 'What did Michael say? When the heck was this? When did this happen?' And she said she thinks it's around 15 years after the entire apocalypse happened." Alright, so I think it's safe to say episode 5 is off the table. Now, the season finale, LaDonna, is a bit of a tough one. There's no evidence of any timeline placement in this episode whatsoever, at least from what I could find. So, if this were to be the one conceptualized to take place 35 years in, I'd be comfortable saying that that was simply a marketing ploy and not to be taken too seriously. However, episode 4, Amy and Dr. Everett, does actually contain some pretty interesting lines that would point to this episode, if any, being the one Channing Powell was referring to. So I'm going to look at every aspect of this episode and present evidence for both why it could take place 35 years in and why it couldn't, and let you make the decision for yourself before giving you my opinion. The reason why this could be so important is because a Major General Beale's projection of humanity's extinction within 14 years, as of The Ones Who Live's finale. If this episode does take place in the timeline's future, it may provide some answers as to how true the projections were, but I have a feeling we're just going to be left with more questions. Right away, the most interesting concept presented to us is the Dead Sector, a section of land divided by a 40-foot deep, 200-meter wide man-made trench spanning hundreds of miles, presumably located in the Wiregrass region of the United States, specifically near the tri-point of Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. This designated area contains a thriving ecosystem, untouched by humans since the outbreak, aside from the researchers and skull hunters, but we'll get into them in a sec. The Dead Sector was made up of escaped zoo animals and the new apex hunter of nature, the Walker, or Homo Mortis as dubbed by Dr. Everett. Chauncey Everett was part of a scientific research team in the early days, studying the dead and their effects on the environment. However, at an undisclosed time after the outbreak, Dr. Everett and his research crew had a falling out and went their separate ways, leaving Dr. Everett to continue his studies alone. However, he would reconnect with one of his former partners after a couple years in isolation, and would begin researching with him once again. But after a few months, his partner would pass from cancer, with his dying wish being for Dr. Everett to study his migration patterns after he turns, which Chauncey would do for the next 7 years. Now, with this information, the timeline doesn't exactly add up to 35 years. From the time of Dr. Everett leaving his research team to the events of the episode, roughly 9 to 10 years have passed. Nothing really indicates that Dr. Everett was with his group studying for 25 years. It's unclear who created the trench separating the dead sector. It's possible it could have been Dr. Everett's research team, but that is one hell of a project for a small group of scientists, even given 25 years of straight work. It could make sense for a large group such as the CRM to dig this trench to separate what's left of the dead from the reclaimed land, as they are the largest known faction in North America, and would have the means to do so, but that has some issues in itself. Why not just kill the rest of the dead? If a group was powerful enough to reclaim the land and separate the safe zone from the walkers, why stop there? Dr. Everett refers to the dead sector as having not been touched by humans since the outbreak, explaining why all the escaped zoo animals have localized within the area and have grown 5 to 10%. This implies the trench would have had to been built very early into the outbreak. So the question of who dug the trench and when they dug it still remains. Throwing even more questions into the mix, we're introduced to Amy, a survivor part of a larger group attempting to resettle the dead sector. Why? Because things are really bad on the other side of the trench, and they're looking for a safe place to build a home and be safe. What the fuck? Okay, so the dead are still everywhere. So they're traveling to a place known to still have the dead everywhere and settle it. Could Amy be referring to humans as the bad on the other side of the trench? Well, I guess, but how exactly would a group large enough to reclaim the land and restore the country be worse than living in a place called the fucking dead sector? Amy tells Dr. Everett it isn't fair that they, assumed to be walkers, have so much land when things out there are so horrible. This just doesn't quite make sense. If this episode does take place in the future, it's implying the dead have been overcome, but humans are once again the threat. To throw even more confusion into the mix, we're introduced to the concept of skull hunters, a group that travels to the dead sector to collect the heads of walkers for either trophies or scare tactics. We really don't know.
Maybe they just want some of those sweet, sweet zombie brain stems, like Nick from Fear, but probably not.
But this implies walkers are a rare sight, and the only place to now find them is the dead sector. Confused yet? Me too. If we are taking the ending of The Ones Who Live into account, the CRM would be reformed into a benevolent force by year 14. If this episode does take place 35 years in, that would leave us with a roughly 20-year time gap to fill in. In that time, society would have to overcome the dead and the 14-year extinction projection, but would have another human threat rise in power across the country. Either once again the CRM somehow, or maybe even a group like Pouvoir from Daryl Dixon. But Dr. Everett's account of the timeline of events just doesn't quite add up. The Walking Dead Fandom Wiki timeline, while of course not a completely reliable source, does have a pretty accurate account of events for all topics. They have this episode listed as taking place 10 years in. However, their source is a tweet from Julian Canon
with a synopsis of the episode stating Dr. Everett was in isolation for a decade.
Now, if you ask me, this doesn't exactly confirm it to be year 10. Rather, Dr. Everett just spent 10 years in isolation, which we already knew. This doesn't tell us how long he was researching with his team for. So I believe this timeline isn't 100% accurate. But remember, the 35 years post-outbreak thing wasn't really supposed to be said in the first place, and was never stated anywhere else.
Don't quote me on that, Scott will kill me, but
So what should we believe? In my opinion, there's evidence pointing it in both directions. Who would have the time or power to dig the trench within the first 10 years of the outbreak? But why would the Skull Hunters need to travel to the dead sector to collect the heads? Dr. Everett's story isn't really implied to have happened over 35 years, but Amy implies the walkers are confined to the dead sector and there's another threat on the other side. But if this episode does take place 10 years in, what the fuck are they talking about? What are Skull Hunters? What are they doing? What is happening? It's really up to you to determine when this episode was conceptualized to take place within the timeline, but I think the question we really should be asking is, should it even be considered canon? Tales of the Walking Dead as a show was an extremely mixed bag. If we are considering it to be 100% canon, then we are saying it is 100% fact Daryl Dixon can get stuck in a weird Groundhog Day time loop. Or Rick Grimes can wake up one day and be tormented by a ghost. Okay, bad example, touche. But you get what I'm saying. Tales felt like an experimental show to see what people would tolerate and what they wouldn't. The only episode to feature already seen characters from the main show was the Alpha episode, but even that throws its canonicity into question as it retcons the Whisperer's origins into not being founded by Alpha, which is heavily implied to be in the main show by season 10, episode 2. Sure, some episodes can fit into the canon just fine, like the Terry Crews episode, but if we're saying some are canon and some aren't, then how do we know Amy and Dr. Everett is? Well, if I were to guess, I'd theorize this episode was conceptualized to take place 35 years into the outbreak, but as development for the Ones Who Live continued, and ideas for the 14-year extinction projection developed, directions were changed, explaining why Gimple wouldn't want this stated anywhere. It's not like they haven't changed directions in the past. So, in my opinion, again, my opinion, this episode was made under the thought it was 35 years in by the writers, but isn't meant to be taken that way under Gimple's vision, as there's no mention of its timeline placement in the episode, interviews, or the synopsis, effectively making it just another weird blip in the Walking Dead universe. If I'm being honest, I don't think it's going to be followed up on anyway, as Tales had pretty weak viewing numbers, and we haven't heard anything on a season 2 besides a weird rumor of a more Tales of the Walking Dead series that have kinda come and gone. I did a poll the other day on what you guys think, and with a pretty decent voting pool, it seems most of the fanbase is pretty split or unsure on its timeline placement. I think if Channing Powell never said that in the interview, we would probably never suspect it to be that far ahead in the first place. So what do you guys think? Does the Tales episode, Amy and Dr. Everett, take place 10 years into the timeline or 35 years into the timeline? Or hell, do you think it's a completely different episode she was talking about and I'm completely wrong? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching, folks. If you like this video, hit that like button, and if you're feeling generous, hit that sub button as well. Take it easy.